Okay. Our sequences this week are absence of evidence is evidence of absence, and conservation of expected evidence. So, absence of evidence. The sequence begins with a quote from Robin Dawes' Rational Choice in an Uncertain World. The quote talks about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. When California Governor Earl Warren testified before a congressional hearing, a questioner pointed out there had been no sabotage or any other type of espionage by the Japanese Americans up to that time. Warren responded, "I take the view that this lack of subversive activity is the most ominous sign in our whole situation. It convinces me more than perhaps any other factor that the sabotage we are to get, the fifth column activities are timed just like Pearl Harbor was timed. I believe we're just being lulled into a false sense of security." And by the way, fifth column, I had to look that up. That's referenced a few times in the sequence. It's just a group of people who undermine a larger group from within. Eliezer says, consider Warren's argument from a Bayesian perspective, where seeing evidence for something means we should give our hypotheses higher probability. Shouldn't the opposite also be true? Using Bayes' theorem, Eliezer lays out the math behind the Japanese-American sabotage question. He says, let E stand for observation of sabotage, negation of E for no sabotage, H1 for the Japanese-American fifth column hypothesis, and H2 for the hypothesis that no fifth column exists. The conditional probability P of E given H is our confidence in E if H were true. A quote, whatever the likelihood that a fifth column would do no sabotage, the probability of P, not E, with H1, it won't be as large as the likelihood that there's no sabotage, given that there's no fifth column. The probability of P of not E given H2. So observing a lack of sabotage increases the probability that no fifth column exists. So he says this doesn't prove no fifth column exists, but in probability theory, absence of evidence is always evidence. Absence of evidence is always evidence of absence. In real life, a cause might not reliably produce signs of itself, but the absence of a thing definitely won't produce any signs. And at the end, Eliezer brings up the fallacy of the gaps in the fossil record, pointing out that because fossils form very rarely, it's futile to trumpet the absence of a weakly permitted observation, when so many other strong positive observations already are recorded. In that same vein, if there are no positive observations at all, then it might be time to worry, so hence the Fermi paradox. And he ends this by reiterating, your strength as a rationalist is your ability to be more confused by fiction than by reality. If you're equally good at explaining any outcome, you have zero knowledge. I forget if this was the first time he ever actually... I feel like this was a quote that was in a previous sequence or somewhere else, but I might be misremembering just because I remember the quote so strongly. And I didn't remember that it belonged to the sequence.
I think this is the earliest use of that particular quote. Is the noticing confusion post earlier in the original sequences than this one?
He definitely talks about noticing confusion a lot.
Yeah, I just don't know if it was this your strength as a rationalist is your ability to be more confused. Maybe because I heard it in Methods of Rationality first.
Yeah, because the Harry's conversation with Professor Quirrell in Diagon Alley references this and a couple of other very Yudkowsky things. And the thing which in that vein, reading the quote from Governor Warren that was in support of the internment made me think, I can't believe this. You can't have every possible observation confirm your theory.
Some quick Google foo suggests that the sentence, your strength as a rationalist is your ability to be more confused by fiction than reality, than by reality, was first made by Eliezer Yudkowsky in a LessWrong post 2 days prior. So this is part of a sequence about this notion, but it is not literally the first post.
So you might have discussed it on the previous episode or something.
Yeah. I want to say that there's also a footnote at the end of this one where he says, if any of this sounds confusing, see my discussion of Bayesian updating towards the end of The Machine and the Ghost, the third volume of Rationality from AI to Zombies. So I'll put a link to that too.
I guess the main thing I see here that I take out of this is that lack of evidence for something, when contextualized, where like if you're doing something that you would expect to generate evidence for this thing if it existed, and you're like generating a bunch of other evidence about other things, and like you keep not seeing evidence for a particular thing, I think that like that hole being there sort of like shows up in the shape of data points around it, and that shape is evidence of the thing not being there.
I think it depends on sort of how far the hypothesis is sticking its neck out about a particular piece of evidence. Like, until the LIGO detected gravitational waves, we had an absence of that particular evidence for general relativity, but we had a whole bunch of other evidence for general relativity that meant that the absence of this extremely unusual phenomenon shouldn't be taken as strong evidence against. But when we did finally observe it, this is something that's blindingly improbable by under any other theory of physics that we know about. So it's a strongly predicted rather than... The absence of the detection was a weakly permitted negative evidence, and the eventual detection was a strongly predicted positive evidence.
One lens that I think is useful in thinking about this is sort of imagining possible worlds. And so if we have a world in which there is no subterfuge by Japanese Americans, and one in which there is this sabotage, then sort of if you run all these possible worlds together, every passing day that you don't see any sabotage is one where some of the worlds where there is sabotage are inconsistent, because in some of those worlds the sabotage had already happened and you had noticed. And so as time goes by and you see none of this occurring, each of those, all of the more and more of the worlds in that universe where this hypothesis is true are sort of dying off and being ruled out from consideration, while none of the ones where it isn't happening are being invalidated. So the pool of your hypothesis space that is taken up by this hypothesis is false grows over time.
And one other thing on reflection, and I think this comes up in the comments on this post, but I haven't read the comments for a while. Although Governor Warren probably didn't know the reason, there was intelligence to suspect the existence of organized possible sabotage at the time, but not stuff they could talk about publicly. So there's also an issue here where there's some really motivated reasoning here trying to point whoever is listening to what Warren is saying in the direction of believing something that they know for what's not the real reason they believe it.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the motivated reasoning in politics, because Eliezer's kind of writing these as advice to general people, and then here's an example of somebody doing the bad thing. But the problem I have with some of the sequences and trying to get people who aren't already bought into it or in the rationality community to see that this stuff is important is some of these are just ideas that if you said them are going to be really obvious on their face. Like, the idea that if there's no evidence for something, then maybe that thing doesn't exist. Like, if you tried to tell that to somebody as though it were a revelation, they'd be like, well, yeah, no shit. But then apparently this governor can, like, make this speech and people can be like, yeah, that is suspicious that there's been no sabotage. There's probably going to be sabotage.
Yeah, and I think that getting the full point of this post requires the context of a thing that is often said otherwise in sort of the scientific community, I guess, that the opposite claim of this title, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I think that is true outside of the context of doing things that you would expect to generate evidence.
That particular one, I get the sense that, although I think technical limitations would have prevented you from actually doing it, that the is should be italicized or bold-faced, because people do fall back on that frequently in discussions ranging from religion to alternative medicine to all sorts of other stuff. That the fact that there's no evidence in either direction is a license to believe the specific thing. Right. And no, the fact that there's evidence that should be easy to find and we don't have any evidence is, in fact, weak evidence of absence. Like he says, absence of proof is not proof of absence, but absence of evidence is evidence of absence.
Right. Or evidence is, in the sense, is like, you should update your probabilities at least a little bit.
Yeah. Like,
Not necessarily a lot.
it is the case that the amount that you update when you don't see the thing can be much smaller than the amount that you update when you do see the thing. You know, if I ordered pizza and I want to know if it will arrive, every passing second that I don't see the pizza delivery van probably only makes my probability that it has not arrived go up by a very minuscule fraction each second. But if there's a second that comes by when I do see it, then my probability probably goes up to 99.99% unless there are pizza van impersonators driving around my town.
Well, that sounds like the mother
Love
of
this
all
example.
segues into the next step, into the next post.
I was hoping that somebody would do that. Conservation of expected evidence. In this one, Eliezer starts talking about a priest named I'm going to say this terribly, so I'm just going to say Frederick Spee von Langenfeld.
Spee.
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 Oh, God.
Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld.
Yeah,
Well, I guess
that's
that's it.
You heard the confession of condemned witches, and describe the decision tree for accusing condemned witches. If the witch has led an evil and improper life, she was guilty. If she had led a good and proper life, this too was proof for witches to assemble and try to appear especially virtuous. After the woman was put in prison, if she was afraid, this proved her guilt. If she was not afraid, this proved her guilt, for witches characteristically pretend innocence and wear a bold front. And the quote goes on. Eliezer points out Spee was in the unique position to act as a confessor to many witches, so he was able to observe every branch of the accusation tree. But in any individual case, you would only hear one branch of the dilemma, so its one-sidedness might not have been as obvious. He goes back to the rule that absence of evidence is evidence of absence, and says you can't have it both ways. You would call the more general law that this falls under conservation of expected evidence. The expectation of the posterior probability after viewing the evidence must equal the prior probability. Therefore, for every expectation of evidence, there's an equal and opposite expectation of counter-evidence. Or, on average, you should expect to be exactly as confident as when you started out. So, if, like the governor in the previous post, you claim no sabotage is evidence for the fifth column hypothesis, you also have to believe seeing sabotage is an argument against a fifth column. And the same he says for arguing a good and proper life is evidence that someone's a witch, or that God hides his existence to test humanity's faith. At the end, he asserts it's impossible for a Bayesian to seek evidence confirming a theory, because you can't expect your confidence in a fixed proposition to be higher than before. Or I guess you might say you can't control how confident you feel. You can only look for evidence to test a theory.
I'm a bit confused by the statement that you should be the same amount of confident before and after. Do you understand that?
So
Well, I guess your confidence equals 100%.
the way that I see this is like if I know that in 10 minutes I'm going to see some evidence, you know, the lab results are going to come back, that my confidence in the hypothesis right now should be equal to what I expect my confidence to be, the average confidence that I expect to have in 10 minutes, which maybe currently it's 50%, and in 10 minutes I think there's a 2/3 chance it'll be 60%, and a 1/3 chance that it'll be 30%, assuming that I have done my multiplication right. But that on average, I should not expect that my confidence would change, because if I could forecast my future beliefs, then I would just now believe whatever I thought I would believe in the future on average.
Yeah, since one of the classical ways of introducing people to Bayes' theorem is the test for a disease that's got some prevalence in the general population, and the test is X% accurate, there's a pretty good chance, given whatever accuracy of the test, that the positive result means actual infection, and there's a pretty good chance that a negative result means no actual infection. But if you run this on everyone, the probability that you're still going to end up with exactly the general population prevalence of the disease. That probability is not affected by your testing it.
Okay. Yeah, that much makes sense.
Yeah. He explains this realization can take a load off your mind, because then you don't have to worry about how to interpret facts anymore. And ends with, human psychology is so screwed up.
I think
Which actually, yeah, I remember kind of...
Go ahead.
I think I can sometimes utilize this a little bit to make myself be a little bit more rational and do something like, okay, I query my brain as to what I expect to think in 5 years about this decision. And if my expectation of what I think, of what future wiser me thinks about this is different than what I currently think, then maybe I try and update on what current me thinks to more closely resemble the future version of me that I think has better information. Like sometimes I think my brain is better at forecasting what I will believe in the future than it is at accurately having an appraisal of what probability I should assign to something now.
Although I feel like in the spirit of this, you would have to then sort of also have the future you that was wrong and become both of them.
Yeah, like, but I think sometimes I can say, like, I think maybe half of all future me's think this is a bad decision, and half of them think it was a good decision, so I probably shouldn't be 90% confident it's good right now. I should really only think it's 50%.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
This reminds me of the practice of doing a pre-mortem, where you're trying to come up with a plan, and then you're like, okay, so I think this plan is going to work for these reasons, but if I imagine in the future the plan has failed, what happened? It can be easier to conceptualize it that way, and then you can kind of go back to the present and alter your plan
That kind
in
of
such a way as to take into account the things that went wrong.
Yeah, I think sort of this is another theme of maybe your brain is trying to lie to you sometimes about things that it would like to believe, and so you're starting this project and parts of your brain are all very excited and are telling you that nothing can possibly go wrong, but the part of your brain that looks into the future or conditions on things having gone wrong hasn't quite gotten this memo. And so if you can ask other parts of your brain, then you can maybe circumvent the parts that are trying to give you confirmation bias and update your probabilities in ways that are not truth-seeking.
Mm-hmm.